Coming up on Primary Care, we're here at Second Ebenezer Baptist Church in Detroit talking to research professor Arline Geronimus about the effect of weathering on the health of African Americans.
Weathering will happen to anybody who's treated the way Black Americans are treated in the society. It's just what the human biological canvas, what happens to it in the face of these structured, chronic stressors.
Hello and welcome to Primary Care, the show dedicated to improving the health and care of African Americans. I'm Dr. Lonnie Joe. The country is waking up to what Black Americans have known for centuries and what public health statistics have shown for decades, and that is systemic injustice, the form of everyday life take a physical wear and tear and often a deadly toll on Black and marginalized communities. The toll is called weathering and describes how the constant stress of racism may lead to premature aging and poor health outcomes for Black people, like adverse pregnancies, infertility, disabilities, and disproportionately high death rates from chronic conditions. If you are new to the concept of weathering, you're not alone. We invited Dr. Arline Geronimus to be here today to explain to us what weathering is. Dr. Geronimus is a professor at the University of Michigan School of Public Health and a member of the National Academy of Medicine. She's here to explain the concept of weathering and how it impacts the health of African Americans. Dr. Geronimus, welcome to Primary Care.
Thank you very much.
You've been doing research on weathering since 1992 when you first coined that term, which makes you kind of special in the history books, coining a term like that. Why is it so important to understand weathering when we look at health disparities, in particular the health of African Americans?
We've thought we knew what caused the health disparities, and we've been wrong. We elevated, as a profession in public health, reducing and ultimately eliminating health disparities as a national high priority goal in 1990. And since then, things have either stayed entrenched or gotten worse, depending on the outcomes that you're looking at.
30 years, we haven't moved this needle?
We have not moved this needle. Sometimes we've moved it in the wrong direction. And I believe that's because we've been aiming at the wrong targets. We've thought about what the disparity was about, either simply in terms of medical care disparities, which are important, but they're only one factor, or we've thought there was something genetically different between white and Black people, or culturally different. We've had a lot of sort of what I would call racist stereotypes that have infused our science and and even more our public policy, so that people were looking at issues of, again, biology in the form of genetics, but also looking at health behaviors. It was seen as something that individual Black people had to take more responsibility for. And there were not generous versions of that that scapegoated Black people for their poor health. And then there were the little more liberal versions where we need to educate people. But they were missing what weathering captures, which is that living in an unequal society and being in the marginalized group, and the longest marginalized group. Black Americans, of course, are not the only groups that have been marginalized in the United States, but there's quite a long and shameful history that we're still living with now. That takes a toll on the body in a number of ways, which damage the body and lead to all these different health problems. And I think that over the 30 years since I first introduced the concept of weathering, we've gotten more evidence in its favor. We've understood more about what the mechanisms would be. We've been willing to talk about biological mechanisms again. One of the problems with the kind of scientific racism that thought if there was anything biological, it had to be genetic and essential to being Black, some kind of bundle of genes that have black skin color and hypertension, say. People have been afraid to look at biological mechanisms because it was conflated with these more racist, essentialist, DNA-centric views. But of course, illness is something that happens in the body. And so there have to be biological mechanisms.
Yeah, the body's going to respond to everything.
Exactly. Your body spends all day, every day, trying to adjust to its environment. And, even there are biological mechanisms when you stand up so that you don't lose your balance. You start shivering if it's cold outside, sweating if it's hot. Your body is actually this incredible creation that works very hard to calibrate what's going on in it biologically to suit the circumstances. And what weathering comes down to biologically is that one of the circumstances that human beings are adapted to is what many people are aware of the physiological stress response, or they might know it as the fight or flight or freeze response. When your life is threatened, we go into automatic pilot, but that has physiological impacts, which it needs to have in the moment, because what it does is you have a cascade of stress hormones through your body, which then has your heart pumping harder, sending blood to large muscles so you can fight or flee, not sending as much blood to other parts of the body, and so it's a wonderful mechanism if you're dealing with being, running in the savannah and seeing a cheetah. And it works beautifully in that circumstance. You get flooded with these hormones that give you your best chance of surviving the cheetah. Not a very good chance necessarily,
Yeah,
but
you can't outrun them, that's for sure. You
right.
can't outrun them, that's for sure.
Right, but you have some chance, or you have some chance of surviving their attack because it also hypes up the immune system and all.
So basically, going back to medical school and physiology and all of the things that we were taught has been extended to talk about how other processes of life, like your zip code, has an effect on, in a similar fashion,
Right.
that the things we learned in physiology would have also the endorphins, the enkephalins, and
Absolutely.
the oxidative stress that we are so
Absolutely.
involved in now, and it's a negative effect.
Well, it can be when it was made to avoid dying at the paws of cheetahs, it was meant to be short. It was sort of, Robert Sapolsky, who has studied a lot of the stress response, he's a Stanford professor, he talks about that what the stress response was about initially was 3 minutes of terror, after which it was either over or you're over, one or the other, but it's short. And then your body calms down and goes back to its everyday functioning, and so blood starts returning to the parts of the body that they weren't sending oxygenated blood to. You don't constrict your veins as much to send blood quickly to your heart or large muscles so you can flee. You become how you're supposed to be most of the time. And so that's a very adaptive response, a very short, very specific, acute response. But what's happened in modern life is that we don't often face cheetahs. But if you are a member of a marginalized group, you do face chronic stressors. And so your body is never relieved of those stress hormones. And part of our adaptive response is it's better, if in the cheetah situation, it's better to overreact to a false alarm than miss a true alarm.
That's interesting.
Right. So one of the things racism does is it gives the people who are victimized by it or oppressed by it reason to be vigilant a lot of the time and be quick to respond to what might turn out to be a false alarm, but they have a reasonable expectation. It's not that they're overreacting or they're crazy. It's that their life experience and what they've seen on the news and in their everyday lives have told them that there are going to be threats out there, and it's better to keep alert for them. And those threats come in many forms, and many of them most white people would think are benign or they wouldn't see as threats at all. So that we're placing people in a position where they're endlessly vigilant. And so then the stress hormones never recede, and you don't get blood to certain tissues and organs as much as you should. You don't get blood to your fetus if you're a pregnant woman. You get too much to your arteries and your heart, so you get enlarged hearts, you get hypertension.
Sure. And we know that overutilization of any organ system has bad effects.
Absolutely.
I can see the adrenal gland being burnt out from pumping to stressors that are related to racism. This is a fascinating cascade of.
Yeah, and so we've missed all that as we've talked about individual health behavior or medical care, which is very important. And it certainly is important in a case where bodies are being weathered, because your last chance to not die young from weathering is to get decent medical care. But that's sort of tertiary, what we call tertiary prevention.
Right.
So
so we missed a whole body of knowledge that accelerates the aging process.
Yes, and the other part of it that we got completely wrong is a lot of the theories about racial inequities in health of, say, the 90s or the 80s, 90s, early 21st century. It wasn't just they blamed the victim, but they talked about it as if people were being lazy. You know, they pulled on old tropes that have gone back through American history about Black people being lazy, not taking personal responsibility, being culturally deficient. And so one of the cruel ironies about weathering is that, in fact, one of the things that exacerbates weathering is working hard and batting your head against a structural racist wall. And so it's actually people who weather, some of it is the exposure to all the different toxins, whether they're environmental, whether they're cultural, from the dominant culture, I mean.
You know, just listening to you in this short period of time, I can see the effects of something like weathering having a synergistic effect on the medical problems that we deal with every day, that we have focused on. That's where, you know, that's what we do, you know, 10, 12 hours a day, wondering why we are not improving some of these states at times. I mean, over the years, we've taken care of patients who you had to treat differently, intensify the treatment. Was it because the weathering factor was missed or not addressed? And not that we can address it to the degree that it causes a change in the patient, but the ability to identify the problem, whether you can do anything about it, is very important also. And that seems to be what you're saying in terms of what we have missed. You mentioned how you use the game Jenga. Talk to us about that.
That term was introduced to me when I was listening to an interview with Emerald Snipes Garner, who is the sister of Erica Garner, who was Eric Garner's daughter, who died at age 27. Age 27, and was counted a maternal mortality. She'd had a baby about 4 months before she died, but she had an enlarged heart, and she also had asthma, and she had a heart attack that killed her. But she had, in those 4 months, she had sort of taken on the mantle of the Black Lives Matter movement, the part of it especially geared to end police brutality. She had, on behalf of her father, and as she's grieving, she became a major spokesperson. And what Emerald, her sister, said is that this exhausted her. It wasn't that obviously she didn't want her father to have died that way. She didn't want to have been put in that position. But she felt compelled to do that for him and for Black people more generally. And she was a very lucid and steadfast spokesperson for Black Lives Matter. But it really had exhausted her at the same time as she felt compelled to do it. And that fits into this part of weathering, which is about the people who act. It's not the people who lie on the couch eating double cheese pizza and getting exercise by pressing the remote control. It's not, that's what we've been led to believe. People who eat all the wrong things, who don't exercise. It's everybody to some extent, but it's actually more true of the people who engage and who try to survive and overcome and who have tenacity and hope. It's not despair either. We're also told these are deaths of despair. But no, these are deaths of people who are tenacious and hopeful, and who, keep working beyond the limits. And so her sister described her death as that she worked so hard. She said it was like a Jenga. They were taking out pieces of her, tearing her apart, is what Emerald said. And that kind of clicked with weathering in my mind, that was a good metaphor for weathering, because weathering, you have people who are doing everything they can to stay upright and to be good people and to support, not to be personally irresponsible, but to in fact support their whole communities, families, be self-sufficient. And these outside constraints on them and forces are kind of pulling pieces here and they're asking too much of them, insulting them, hurting them, killing their loved ones, whatever. And then there's some point, a fateful block that just makes the whole thing collapse. And that's how I think weathering works. One of the problems I think with our missing weathering all these years in terms of the medical community is that we've focused on single diseases or single organs. So there's cardiovascular disease, or there's diabetes, or there's hypertension. And we don't realize that what weathering does is it erodes every body organ. And how it manifests in a diagnosable disease will be different between different people, or it may manifest as multiple diseases, which does happen very often.
How did you get into this? I mean, this is a fascinating topic. How did you get into this? I mean, not a lot of people walking around talking about weathering.
No, and in fact, for a long time I was really the only person, and many people actually tried to kind of disparage me. But how did I get into it? There's so many levels of answers, but I think the most direct one is when I was in college. I had 2 jobs simultaneously. I actually had 3 or 4 jobs simultaneously, but 2 that really led to this idea. One was I worked as a research assistant to a professor who was studying teenage pregnancy, which was a term that no one used before about the 1970s. In fact, most women in America were teenage mothers, but it wasn't considered a deviant, thing that caused all the problems of society the way it became to be viewed by the 80s and 90s. And so this was just the cusp of beginning to isolate this new class of deviant called the teenage mother, and then also the super predator father. And so I was working for a professor who was on the kind of liberal side of that, which was, there were kind of 2 versions. One was the version he was on, which was about we have to get sex education, abortion rights, contraception to people, but we still have to stop this thing called teen pregnancy. And then there were the people who saw it as a huge moral failing and a sign of decay and wanted to come up with punitive, welfare reform in part was built to punish people who got
pregnant, yes.
So I was working for him and listening to all the things he was saying. And as a sort of white middle class student, what he was saying made sense on the surface. If I had become a teenage mother, I probably wouldn't have gone to college. If, my father would have thrown me out of the house. It would not have been good. But I also had a job teaching at a school for pregnant teenagers, which was actually, the joke of it all, it was actually part of attempts to get sex education. So I was doing what was called rap sessions with a peer. I was about the same age. So this was I was supposed to help them start learning about contraception. Well, I saw several things very quickly that I think is the first real step directly to weathering. One was they knew more than I did. So the idea that, this nice white undergraduate was going to teach them things was not accurate. Secondly, most were very happy to be having babies. we were, the line was that your whole life script is written for you and it's ruined.
Now, this is in a African American.
This is an African American school for teenage mothers. I'm not saying everybody was happy, and most had not literally planned to get pregnant, but some had. And the other thing I saw, because this school was within a clinic, one of my other jobs was to be their peer person who'd go with them to their clinic visits. So I did that, and I saw several things there. One is I saw how badly they were treated by the doctors. And in fact, of great embarrassment to me, the doctors would not only kind of ignore their own patients as they're lying on the table, these are obstetricians and gynecologists, but they'd pull me over just because I guess I was the white college student and start showing me things I had no business seeing and talking to me in kind of a medicalese that I didn't even understand, to kind of show, treating the person on the table like a piece of meat or a non-sentient object, and taking the white undergraduate to say, see, let me show you how her cervix is all, infected with this, or, but I also, and this is a little confusing to say, but I also got to see, obviously, their bodies, and I also was very comfortable with having seen a lot of women's bodies in college, through sports, and you're in the dorm room. And I could see a different level of illness. These are 18-year-olds, 19-year-olds, same age as I was. But I could see their bodies looked different, and also just their medical histories. They had bronchitis that would never go away. Asthma was rampant. And I also, because I was the same age, became friends with a couple of them pretty close. So I also went to their homes, and I saw the living conditions compared to on our, not just in how I had grown up, which wasn't that fancy, but it was middle class. But the college I was at was a very rich college. And so, the privileges we all had, or that other students that I was going to school with had grown up with, I got to see that huge inequity, and I began to wonder, why are people focusing on preventing teen pregnancy per se? I'm not saying I didn't think people should all have the means to prevent pregnancy if they wanted them. But with all these illnesses, with a kind of what looked like aging bodies in teenagers, with really unhealthy living conditions, not because they had bad parents, but because their city was disinvested in and they had rats in their apartments, or no heat, or not enough heat, or no one had fixed the elevator, or the leak in the basement. Why were we getting so involved in their sex lives and their choice of when to have babies? And so that's what really put the thought on my ear, both kind of the intellectual curiosity, what is happening to these young women that they're so ill? And also, why is the dominant culture, the Princeton professors, the policymakers, the presidents, why are they focusing on one little thing and so exaggerating it?
So that triggered this? That
triggered the whole thing. I actually went to graduate school to try and figure out the answer to this question.
Good. Have you seen a difference in men and women, black men and black women, in terms of weathering? I mean,
they both weather.
Right.
I initially got into this through looking at issues of pregnancy and maternal and child health. So I initially was understanding this through the lens of women. And over time, I've also studied, and also reproductive age women, but over time I've done work with men, with women, across the entire life course, with other marginalized groups, Latinx groups, and weathering will happen to anybody who's treated the way Black Americans are treated in the society. It's just what the human biological canvas, what happens to it in the face of these structured, chronic stressors. Now, women are in a slightly different situation from Black men for two reasons. One is they do reproduce. So passing down weathering and having higher risks of having babies born too small or too early, which then also sets that baby up for weathering, is something that happens through the woman's body. But the other thing is the way we have as a society, I believe, done racism is we've been more racist against, it's kind of counterintuitive, but we've been more racist against black men than black women. But that means black women end up being the people who, more often than not, are doing the high effort coping. They're the ones who have the 2 or 3 jobs and families and taking care of their elders who are sick too young because of weathering. That got distorted into a kind of racist trope about emasculating matriarchs or the strong, black woman. But there is a truth that the way we have structured racism in this country, in fact, puts black women statistically in harm's way more than black men. But black men are in harm's way too. And John Henryism was developed more looking at men. It was sort of weathering I was developing about women, and Sherman James was developing John Henryism thinking about men. And as you probably understand, the John Henry metaphor that he used was about how the black man in the folk tale, he beat the machine, so he worked hard and he all on his own and beat the machine, but then he died right away. So that's the metaphor that he chose, and it is a more male metaphor, but they're very related constructs, and they're both gendered ways of Black Americans trying to deal with the adversity they've been dealt.
That is fascinating. We've been doing this show for a while, and I personally am amazed at how much I learn from people who are guests on this show. I mean, this is a fascinating volume of evidence and research that basically, you're right. We've been focusing on not the wrong thing, but not inclusive enough to have something like weathering as a factor. Arline, this has been outstanding. I mean, we'll be here 2 hours from now talking, but we're out of time.
Oh,
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a pleasure. Our guest has been Dr. Arline Geronimus, Professor of Public Health and Research at the University of Michigan. The negative effects of weathering on the lives and health of Black people will not go away until we get serious about fixing the issue of structural racism and discrimination. Thank you for joining us. For Primary Care, I'm Dr. Lonnie Joe.